A Great Argead Saga Alexine, Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, The Sacred Band. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 3, Cleansing of the State. Late evening, the public baths of Thebes. Water, discipline, and power. The transition from the crisp autumn air into the thermae was like stepping into another world. Thick, fragrant steam swirled through the marble halls, carrying the scent of cedar oil and wood smoke. Philip followed Epaminondas through the changing rooms, feeling exposed without his traveling cloak, yet fascinated by the architecture. Large bronze cauldrons hissed over furnace vents, and the sound of splashing water echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Behind Philip, Antigonus gripped his linen wrap tightly against his chest, his eyes darting warily through the hazy vapor. Look at them, Antigonus thought, a cold edge of defensive pride hardening his jaw as he stared at the towering muscular frames of the adult Thebans lounging nearby. They parade around like kings in their own halls, making us feel like naked children brought to the slaughter. They think displaying their strength like this will break us before we even touch a weapon. Beside him, 13-year-old Pethan shrank back slightly, his breath catching in his throat as the thick, humid air hit him. It's suffocating, Pethan thought, his hands trembling slightly as he folded his tunic. In Pella, a bath was private, behind heavy wooden doors with your own attendants. Here, we're thrust into a den of giants. If I don't stand straight, they'll smell the fear on me before the steam even does. 12-year-old Leonidas swallowed hard, his wide eyes scanning the vaulted marble arches and the towering bronze cauldrons hissing in the corners. Everything here is massive, Leonidas thought, feeling utterly minuscule among the dense crowd of veterans. Even the air feels heavy with their presence. I wish I was back in the northern hills, where a boy could grow without everyone staring right through him. Even Amyntas, despite his outward sneer and hardened demeanor, pulled his wrap higher around his waist with an uncharacteristic twitch of discomfort. A den of peacocks showing off their scars, Amyntas thought bitterly, refusing to let his gaze meet the older Theban soldiers, who watch them with assessing, clinical eyes. They want us to feel small. They want us to measure ourselves against their bronze statues and find ourselves wanting. I refuse to give them the satisfaction. As Philip stripped away his tunic in the dim, humid antechamber of the thermae, the sudden contrast struck him with the force of a physical blow. In Macedon, a bath was a hurried necessity. He remembered the iron-reinforced doors of the royal palace in Pella, the private, secluded chambers deep within the inner court, where water was heated laboriously in heavy bronze cauldrons by silent slaves and poured into solitary portable tubs. There, privacy was security, in a court fractured by relentless succession, struggles, and poison. Sharing an uncloaked, vulnerable space with strangers or rivals was a lethal risk. You locked yourself away because exposure invited an assassin's blade. Here, in Thebes, it was a forum. Stepping out into the monumental steam rooms, Philip looked across the sprawling calidarium, where advanced underfloor hypocaust systems pumped roaring furnace heat beneath the tiled marble floors. It was a bustling, steaming theater. Citizens, veteran hoplites, merchants, and generals mingled entirely without cloaks or armor, their bodies gleaming with sweat. Stripped of their outward status symbols, men used curved bronze strigils to aggressively scrape away dirt while simultaneously scrubbing away tactical secrets and political intelligence. Deals were struck across slick benches, military gossip echoed off the vaulted ceilings, and sharp philosophical debates raged through the thick vapor. For the Thebans, the public bath was a direct extension of the phalanx itself. True strength was forged not in isolated, pampered luxury, but in collective exposure, shared endurance, and absolute transparency among peers. By normalizing the stripping away of private barriers, Thebes turned everyday civic life into a disciplined, interconnected machine, where information was currency, bonds were forged in sweat. And the collective gaze of the state watched everyone. As they moved into the tepidarium, a warm room, Philip noticed groups of men lounging in the shallow pools. These weren't just soldiers, they were the city's heart. Philosophers were locked in mid-debate, merchants tallied the day's profits, and young hoplites scraped oil and sweat from their skin with bronze strigils. The warmth was a soothing balm after weeks of road dust, but as Philip began to disrobe next to General Epaminondas, a different sensation washed over him. Epaminondas, a man in his late 40s with a bold, steady frame, moved with an utterly natural ease. His matured body, sculpted by decades of training and the cold mathematics of mobility, was a living record of achievement. His scars were not blemishes, they were the symbols of the freedom Thebes had wrenched from Sparta. For Philip, the act was fraught with a subtle blush. This was his first time truly seeing the unadorned bodies of adults, most of them far older and more physically developed than his still-growing 14-year-old frame. He was at the threshold of his own awakening, and while he had felt a burgeoning pride in his own development in private, he now felt an undeniable sense of smallness. Amidst the mature musculature of Theban citizens, Philip felt a sharp, unfamiliar awareness of his own unformed body. It was a humbling introduction to the physical realities of the adult world. He mimicked his mentor, but instinctively used his towel as a small shield against this sudden, overwhelming exposure. They are built like the city itself, thick-walled, unyielding, and hardened by a system that leaves no room for weakness. Philip thought, his teeth pressing into his lower lip as he looked down at his slender arms and narrow chest. Antigonus sees a cage, and Amintor sees an insult. But they are blind. This isn't just about intimidation. The unself-conscious movements of the men stretching, lounging, or debating in the steam were disarming. Their forms rippled with muscle and sinew, a living testament to the discipline of the gymnasium. Compared to these men, Philip's frame felt slender, almost fragile. He lacked the broad shoulders and the deep chest that spoke of full physical maturity. His muscles, though beginning to harden from years of riding and sparring in the north, seemed merely embryonic. Yet, amidst this landscape of male physicality, intimidation began to turn into admiration. He marveled at the power and artistry of the human form, seeing in these veterans a vision of the strength he aspired to achieve. This was yet another lesson of Thebes, stark and undeniable. A new standard of physical excellence, openly displayed, and a goal to be seized. Epaminondas led Philip into a corner pool where the water was a deep, inviting heat. "Relax, Philip," the general said, sinking into the water with a sigh of relief. "The steam opens the mind as much as the pores. Listen to the room. A man who speaks in the baths speaks as if the walls cannot hear him." Philip carefully descended the steps. The heat enveloped him immediately, seeping into muscles that had been coiled tight for weeks on horseback. He let out a soft sigh of contentment, sinking until the water reached his chin. "It's wonderful," he murmured. Antigonus slid into the adjacent pool, his shoulders dropping slightly beneath the surface, though his eyes remained sharp and defensive. A bathhouse disguised as a house of whispers, Antigonus thought, watching a pair of Theban officers converse quietly across the room. They think because we're young, we don't know how to listen. Every word they drop in the steam is a weapon left unguarded. Beside him, Pethan gripped the stone edge of the pool, his knuckles white. The heat is thick enough to choke you, Pethan thought, his heart hammering against his ribs as the echoes of the soldiers' voices bounced off the vaulted marble. They're talking about wars, Thessaly, Sparta, things we're supposed to be too ignorant to understand. We aren't just here to learn how to fight, we're here to be surrounded by their secrets. Leonatus splashed his feet gently in the shallow end, his wide eyes tracking the rising vapor. Sounds like a giant hive, Leonatus thought, shivering slightly despite the warmth of the water. Every man here is whispering about empires falling and rising. If I listen close enough, maybe I can figure out if we'll ever see Pella again. Amintor leaned back against the dark marble wall, a cynical smirk twisting his lips as he crossed his arms over his chest. Let them chatter about the fall of Sparta and the movements of Phary, Amintor thought bitterly, his jaw tight. They act like masters of the world, but they're just feeding us scraps of information while we sit naked in their pool. We'll store it all away. Every word is a knife we can turn against them later. Epaminondas settled beside Philip, leaning against the smooth stone. Indeed. A good bath washes away more than just dirt, young prince. It washes away the worries of the journey and prepares you for the stillness of thought. Philip sat on the submerged marble bench and closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. He sharpened his ears. Nearby, 2 men, likely junior officers from the Theban garrison, were shrouded in the thickest part of the steam, their voices a low, rhythmic murmur. "Pelopidas thinks the north is settled," one whispered, his voice echoing off the damp marble. "But Alexander of Phary is already moving his pieces in Thessaly. He won't let the Boeotian League hold the mountain passes for long. Let him move, the other replied with a dry chuckle. He hasn't faced the oblique phalanx on open ground. He thinks he's a lion, but Epaminondas is already building the cage. Did you hear? The Macedonians sent a delegation this morning. They want more Theban stone to finish their walls. Sparta is gasping its last, and we are the ones holding the pillow over its face. Philip's mind raced. Macedonian walls, the weakening of Sparta, the instability of Thessaly. These were the gears of the world turning. He realized then that Thebes didn't just rule through the spear. They ruled by managing the survival of others. The first officer spoke again, his tone turning intimate. And what of the boy prince? The Argead? I saw the column come in. He looked small for a hostage. Small, perhaps, the second replied. But Epaminondas has him now. They say the boy's mother is the one to watch, Eurydice. She's the one who invited us in. A woman who sells her own son to save her crown is a woman who knows exactly how the game is played. Philip felt a flash of heat that wasn't from the water, a sharp, stinging pride. He looked at Epaminondas, who remained motionless with his eyes closed, seemingly asleep. But Philip noticed the slight tilt of the general's head. Epaminondas was testing him, waiting to see if he would react to the insult or the information. Philip stayed silent. He took a long, steady breath of the heavy steam, letting the gossip settle into his memory, like the hidden ink of a citale. After the soak, they moved to the Calidarium, the hot room in a bath complex, featuring a hot plunge pool and heated by hypocaust, an underfloor heating system that circulated hot air, creating a very hot and steamy environment for sweating and relaxation, serving as the final, most luxurious bathing stage, where a slave used a strigil to scrape the last of the road dust from Philip's shoulders. The skin beneath felt new, raw, and ready. As they emerged back into the cool night air, Philip felt physically lighter, but his mind was heavy. In Thebes, he realized everything, even a bath, was a political maneuver. Tomorrow, Epaminondas said as they walked back toward the house, we go to the gymnasium. You have heard the gossip of the soldiers. Tomorrow, you will see the men who make them afraid to gossip, forged in cold water. The barracks bath area. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly against the limestone walls of the field to cadets' barracks, baking the sprawling gravel training yards into a kill of dust, sweat, and sun-baked earth. For hours, the older Macedonian youths had been subjected to the relentless rhythm of the Theban military machine, the splintering impact of ash with spears against thick wicker shields, the raw ache of long-distance conditioning runs, and the biting bark of instructors demanding absolute geometrical precision. When the horn finally blew to signal the end of the afternoon drills, the cadets were stumbling wrecks of bruised muscle and caked salt. There would be no steaming, perfumed pools of water here, no tiled floors or heated marble luxury, such as Philip and the younger boys enjoyed in the upper estates. Hunched over a massive, moss-rimmed stone basin just off the edge of the training yard, 17-year-old Iolaus dragged a heavy bronze bucket up from the deep cistern, his broad back and shoulders corded with exhausted tension. The water inside splashed over the rim, biting and brutally cold against his heated skin. No marble tubs. No slaves to pour scented oils, Iolaus thought, gritting his teeth as he heaved the freezing water over his head, gasping sharply as the chill hit his abused spine. They treat us like draft animals. They want us stiff, raw, and aching, so that by the time we crawl onto our cots, we're too exhausted to even dream of rebellion. But let them keep their ice water. Every bucket of this freezing dirt we wash off makes us tougher than their precious homegrown whelps. Beside him, 16-year-old Sinane spat a mouthful of dust into the drainage trough, his lean frame trembling slightly from the sheer physical toll of the day. He stripped off his sweat-soaked linen tunic, wringing it out with a violent twist that sent muddy water splattering across the stone flags. His sharp, cynical eyes scanned the perimeter of the washing yard, tracking a pair of older Boeotian cadets, who were watching them with cold, assessing stares from across the pavilion. Look at them watching us like hungry dogs, Sinane thought, a bitter, defiant smirk cutting across his face. They think a few hours of shield bashing and a bucket of well water is going to break the northern spirit. They don't know what it's like to ride the frozen ridges of Upper Macedonia with nothing but a leather cloak and a knife. This isn't a hardship, it's just a warm-up. A few paces away, 15-year-old Agus leaned heavily against the stone pillar of the washing shed, his hands gripping the cold rim of a basin as he tried to steady his ragged breathing. His high-strung analytical mind was already racing, cataloging the layout of the drainage ditches and calculating the water supply of the garrison, even while his muscles screamed in protest. 3 cisterns feeding the entire western barracks. Agus calculated silently, his eyes tracking the stone channels cut into the courtyard floor. If they ever cut off the main aqueduct from the Cadmea, this entire wing would run dry in less than 3 days. Everything here is designed for endurance, stripping away every ounce of softness until you're nothing but bone and reflexes. They aren't just teaching us how to fight a phalanx, they're trying to rewrite our nervous systems. Down at the smaller end of the stone basin, 14-year-old Agus moved with quiet, methodical efficiency. He dipped a coarse woolen cloth into the cold water, pressing it firmly against the deep purple bruised welt across his collarbone, where a Theban training spear had caught him during the morning's close quarters push. He didn't wince, nor did he offer a single word of complaint to the others, his expression a mask of absolute unblinking composure. No use groaning over a bruise, Agus thought steadily, rinsing the cloth and watching the red-tinted water swirl down the stone drain. Complaining doesn't shorten the march, and anger doesn't soften the stone. The ones who survive a foreign court aren't the loudest ones. They're the ones who learn how the machinery works while everyone else is busy fighting it. Let them keep us cold and sore. We're absorbing every drop of it. At the end of the long stone trough, 14-year-old Bathhouse stood stock still, staring down into the reflective surface of the water before him. His slender frame was coated in a fine layer of white dust and dried sweat, his muscles aching with a deep, bone-weary fatigue. Yet his dark eyes burned with an intense, laser-like focus that entirely ignored the physical discomfort around him. While Iolaus felt caged and Sinane felt insulted, Bathhouse saw through the crude, utilitarian brutality of the barracks washing area, straight to its core design. They think this cold water is a punishment, Bathhouse thought, his fingers curling tightly around the edge of the stone basin as a chilling, brilliant clarity settled over him. They think denying us luxury will make us compliant. But they are wrong. Every hardship they engineer here is a masterclass in efficiency. No waste, no excess, no weakness. They are forging us in raw iron because they don't realize what a northern mind can do with these tools. When I take this discipline back to Pella, I won't just break their phalanx, it'll rebuild the world in our own image. Bathhouse scooped a handful of the freezing water, dashing it sharply across his face to clear away the last dregs of dust, his expression hardening into absolute resolve. He turned his head, catching Iolaus's burning gaze across the wash basins. "Stop glaring at the water, Iolaus," Bathhouse said quietly, his voice cutting cleanly through the splashing and the rough murmurs of the surrounding cadets. "The cold won't answer you. Save your breath for tomorrow's line." Iolaus wiped the dripping water from his forehead, a grim, acknowledging nod passing between them, as they turned back to face the gathering dusk of the Cadmea. Clean slate. The long, whitewashed corridor of the page and student quarters echoed with the muffled sounds of 25 boys scrubbing away the dust of the northern road. Unlike the rugged stone troughs of the older field cadets are the warm domestic washrooms of the private foster estates, the bathing facilities for Category 2 were built with a clean, institutional precision. A row of deep limestone basins fed by stone channels of fresh, cool spring water, designed to instill order and shared routine among the upper age pages. In their assigned communal washroom, 11-year-old Theban stood over one of the stone basins, splashing water briskly across his chest and arms. His movements were efficient and unhurried, masking the heavy, self-imposed burden he carried as the oldest of their 4-man squad. The water is cold, but it wakes the senses, Theban thought, wiping the stinging spray from his eyes while casting a watchful glance toward the door. In Pella, a bath came with attendants checking for hidden daggers and tasters sampling the soap. Here, we wash ourselves. General Charon wants us self-reliant. If I show a single crack of weakness now, the younger ones will panic. I have to hold the line for them. Beside him, 10-year-old Archidamus scrubbed furiously at his forearms, his teeth clenched in stubborn irritation as the coarse soap chafed against his skin. He threw a hostile glare at the unornamented limestone walls around him. "This is ridiculous," Archidamus muttered aloud, his voice dropping into an angry hiss as he sloshed water over the rim of the basin. Look at this place. No mosaics, no bronze fittings, not even a dedicated servant to lay out a fresh chiton. They herd us in here like sheep coming back from pasture. My father is a companion of the royal guard. I shouldn't be washing my own tunic in a public trough alongside hostages from half-barbarian clans. Polycles, age 9, stood a few paces away, his compact frame dripping as he rinsed a small sponge. His analytical eyes weren't on the soap or the lack of luxury. Instead, they were tracing the angle of the stone drainage slots in the floor and measuring the height of the high, iron-grated clear-story windows. The drainage slope is 3 fingers wide per stride, Polycles noted silently, his mind clicking through the tactical layout of the building with the precision of an architect. If a flood or an emergency hit this wing, the water would clear out through the central courtyard in under 2 minutes. Everything here has a purpose. They aren't trying to degrade us, they're stripping away the useless pageantry of the palace, so we learn how an army camps on the march. Archidamus is too busy being insulted to see the blueprint. Down at the end of the stone trough, 8-year-old Drusillus struggled to lift a heavy earthenware pitcher of fresh water, his small arms trembling under the weight. He had placed his treasured wooden figurine of a hunting dog safely on a dry cedar shelf, just above the basin, keeping his tear-stained eyes locked onto it as if it were a beacon of home. Don't drop the pitcher, Drusillus told himself, biting his lower lip until it turned white. If I drop it, the water spills everywhere, and the older boys will think I'm just a crying baby who doesn't belong in the garrison. Phaeditus caught sight of the struggling younger boy out of the corner of his eye. Without a word of reprimand, he stepped over, placing his large, steady hands over Drusillus' small fingers on the clay handle of the pitcher. Together, they tipped the vessel, sending a clean, refreshing cascade of water over the younger boy's dusty back. Drusillus let out a sharp, surprised gasp as the cold water hit his skin, but the tension instantly drained from his narrow shoulders. He looked up at Phaeditus with wide, grateful eyes. The water's cold, Drusillus, but it washes the road right off, Phaeditus said softly, his tone carrying a quiet, authoritative warmth that instantly steadied the 8-year-old. You're doing fine. Keep your grip. Drusillus nodded, a tiny, brave smile touching the corners of his mouth. He didn't yell at me, Drusillus thought, a wave of profound relief washing over his chest as he reached for the coarse woolen towel. Phaeditus is like an older brother. Maybe this place isn't a dark tower after all. As long as we stick together in this room, we'll be safe. Archidamus stopped his furious scrubbing, watching the exchange between the older and younger boy. The angry flush on his cheeks slowly faded into a sullen, thoughtful silence. He looked down at his own soapy hands, then glanced over at Polycles, who was quietly wringing out his tunic with practiced, disciplined efficiency. We're all we've got down here in the south, Archidamus admitted bitterly to himself, the defiant armor cracking just enough to let the cold reality in. If I keep fighting the walls, I'll just break my own hands against them. Hand me that drying cloth, Polycles, Archidamus grumbled aloud, his voice losing its sharp edge as he reached out. Before the water freezes on my skin, and these Theban masters decide to march us out into the gravel yard in our shifts. Polycles passed him the coarse linen without a word, a subtle, knowing glint in his eye. Together, the 4 boys finished cleaning away the grime of their long captivity, drying off in the damp, echoing stone room, before turning back down the corridor toward their shared quarters, 4 boys bound by a single room, bracing themselves for whatever dawn would demand of them next. Woven shield. Across the upper and lower quarters of Thebes, the sun sank low behind the limestone ridge of the Cadmea, throwing long, amber shadows across the courtyards. In the quiet, sheltering homes of the city's most decorated commanders, the brutal dust of the northern road was finally washed away. Not with the freezing, utilitarian troughs of the military barracks, but in the warm, restorative sanctuary of private estate baths. All 8 boys could not fit into a single basin. Rather, the 2 households simultaneously engaged in the intimate steaming ritual of cleansing their youngest Macedonian wards, Archidamus's estate. In the sheltered, stone-paved washroom of Archidamus and Gorgo's home, the air hung thick with the comforting steam of heated spring water and the mild scent of olive oil and unspun wool. Gorgo knelt beside a broad, shallow bronze tub, her sleeves rolled up and her lined face softened by an expression of deep, maternal, fierce kindness. With the steady help of a trusted maid pouring water from large clay pitchers, she coaxed the 4 youngest boys closer. At ages 5 and 7, the boys were small enough that 2 could sit comfortably in the wide basin at once, while the others waited on warm wooden benches wrapped in coarse linen wraps. Lysias 7 sat rigid in the warm water, his small hands gripping the rim of the bronze bowl so hard his knuckles turned white. He watched Gorgo with wide, suspicious eyes. "She's too kind," Lysias thought, his chest rising and falling in quick, nervous hitches as the warm water lapped against his shivering ribs. In Pella, when the court smiled, it meant the purge was coming. But there are no guards at the door. No one is shouting. The water actually feels like the hot springs near Edessa." He swallowed hard, letting out a trembling breath as Gorgo gently washed the grit from his tangled hair. Maybe they really aren't going to hurt us." Beside him in the tub, Phormio 5 stared down at his own reflection in the soapy water, his lower lip trembling, as the reality of being torn from his mother finally caught up with him. A single tear tracked down his dust-streaked cheek, dropping quietly into the basin with a tiny ripple. "My horse is gone," Phormio thought, a silent sob catching in his throat. "My brothers are miles away in the big barracks. I don't know these people. I want to go home." Yet, as Gorgo placed a warm, heavy woolen towel over his shoulders and pulled him close against her apron, the sheer exhaustion of the journey melted his spine. "Her hands feel like my mother's hands," he realized, burying his face quietly in the rough wool. "It's warm here. I don't want to move." On the wooden bench nearby, Cylon, 6, and little Cletus, barely 6, clutching his wooden horse like a shield, sat side by side. Cylon kicked his bare legs gently against the bench legs, watching the steam rise toward the high ventilation slots in the stone wall. "They give us hot water and clean clothes," Cylon thought, blinking in quiet wonder. "If we're prisoners, we're the luckiest prisoners in the world." Archidamus didn't look at us like we were enemies. He looked at us like we belonged to him. Cletus said nothing, his bright white eyes tracking every movement of the steam and shadows. He let Archidamus, who stood nearby leaning on his veteran staff, reach down and gently lift the little wooden horse from his damp fingers to place it safely on a dry ledge. "Keep your horse safe, little one," Archidamus had rumbled kindly. A Macedonian warrior never loses his mount, even when it's carved of pine. Cletus watched the carved toy rest on the dry wood, a quiet, stubborn resolve settling into his small frame. "They think because we are little, we'll forget who we are," Cletus thought, leaning back as Gorgo splashed warm water over his dusty shoulders. "They can give us all the hot baths they want. Every drop of water washes away the dust of the road, but it doesn't wash away Pella. I will grow up here, under their roofs, and I will learn everything they know." Pelopidus's estate. In the sprawling, colonnaded bath chamber of General Pelopidus's household, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of nervous energy. Here, 13-year-old son Ariston stood awkwardly beside a large stone-rimmed immersion tub, holding stacks of fresh linens, while his mother Timoclea supervised 2 house slaves, managing the bronze heating brazier. Inside the steaming water, Corhugis 7 splashed a handful of water defiantly toward the edge, his chest puffed out like a young hawk cornered in a nest. "They expect us to bow and scrape," Corhugis thought, his dark eyes locked onto Ariston with fierce, northern pride. "They brought us here in a carriage of state, but we aren't their pets. I'm a prince of Macedon. I won't cry in front of these southern strangers." Yet, despite his fierce glare, the sheer warmth of the water was working a traitorous magic on his bruised, aching muscles. He leaned back against the smooth stone rim, letting out a long, shuddering sigh that betrayed how close to collapse he truly was. Beside him, Manilius, 6, was busy scrubbing the road grime from his arms with a rough sponge, his observant eyes darting across the tiled floors and bronze fixtures. No gold leaf, no marble reliefs like the palace at Pella. Manilius analyzed silently, his agile mind already taking stock of the estate's layout. Everything here is built for utility and strength. The floor drains are clean, the water is piped straight from the hill spring. General Pelopidus doesn't live in luxury. He lives like a commander preparing for a siege. If this is how they run a household, no wonder their phalanx doesn't break. In the shallow end of the tub, Simmias, 5, and Polemon huddled close together. Polemon, the youngest of the entire group, still clutched his older brother's dropped brass belt buckle in his damp fist like a holy relic. The metal is cold, Polemon thought, his lower lip trembling as the steam swirled around his face. Everything in Thebes is foreign. But the water isn't cold. It wraps around me like a blanket. When will I see my brother again? Timoclea noticed the boy's distress. She stepped closer, kneeling beside the tub with a gentle, infinite patience that belied the hard years of war and absence she had endured while Pelopidas fought for the city. She reached out, gently prying Polemon's cramped fingers open from around the tarnished brass buckle, replacing it with a soft linen cloth. "Let the metal rest on the shelf, little one," Timoclea said softly, her voice smooth and steady as a flowing stream. "You don't need armor in this house. The journey is over. You are safe now." Simmias looked up at her, blinking away the heavy steam from his eyelashes. She doesn't look like an enemy queen, Simmias thought, profound, aching relief blooming in his chest. She looks motherly, like the women who tended the hearth back home before the border war started. Standing by the doorway, Ariston watched the 4 small Macedonian boys settle into the warmth of the bath. The initial awkwardness of being thrust into the role of an older brother began to evaporate, replaced by a sudden protective surge of pride. They're just kids, Ariston realized, looking down at Corhagis's defiant chin and Polemon's tear-streaked cheeks. Father brought them here as pawns, but right now, in this house, they're just cold, tired boys who miss their mothers. And they're mine to look after. Ariston stepped forward, kneeling down and offering Corhagis a fresh, dry tunic with a small, lopsided grin. "Come on out of the water before you turn into river frogs," Ariston said, his voice dropping its defensive edge. "The kitchen's got honey cakes waiting, and I'll show you where the courtyard garden is before the stars come out." Corhagis stared at the older boy for a long, silent moment, the fierce scowl slowly fading from his face. He took the tunic, pulling himself up from the warm water. "I'm not a frog," Corhagis muttered, though a faint, reluctant smile finally touched the corners of his mouth. "And I can run faster than you." Across both estates, as the steam drifted out into the cooling evening air, the first fragile roots of a new life took hold. Stripped of their dust, warmed by fire and kindness, and watched over by veterans who knew the true cost of war, the youngest sons of Macedon had begun their transformation. Piraeus, illusion of cleansing. The afternoon sun cast long, amber shadows across the courtyard of Lysandra's discreet Apothecary near the foot of the Acropolis. Inside, the air was a thick botanical haze of dried sage, crushed poppy, and roasting fennel. Aristotle pushed open the heavy wooden door, the small bronze bell chiming softly above him. He looked worn, his shoulders bowed beneath the heavy wool of his cloak, as if he had carried the weight of the entire Lyceum all the way from the colonnades. Waiting for him on the low wooden benches were his closest confidants in Athens. Lysandra, whose fingers were stained dark with plant resins, and Menander, who had been lazily flipping through a stack of newly bound papyrus scrolls. To Aristotle's mild surprise, Demetrius of Phalerum sat beside them, his sharp political mind momentarily set aside as he shared a cup of spiced wine. Lysandra looked up from her mortar, wiping a lock of dark hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She noted the heavy, exhausted lines etched around the philosopher's eyes. "You look as though you've been dragging a plow through stone all morning, Aristotle," Lysandra asked gently, setting aside her pestle. "How did your day at the Lyceum go?" Aristotle let out a long, weary sigh, sinking heavily onto a bench and pressing the heels of his hands against his temples. "It was an endless trial," Aristotle confessed, his voice dropping to a low, frustrated rumble. "It is not the philosophy that drains me. It is the petty, grinding friction of the place. Today alone, I had arrogant students arguing semantics just to hear their own voices and rival instructors whispering politics behind my back. It is a constant, suffocating extra burden of sort. I tried to push it away, to lock it out of my thoughts, but it hangs in my mind like a foul smoke." He shook his head, staring bitterly down at his calloused fingers. "If I did not have these endless coils of irritation snarling at my thoughts, I could finally finish my manuscripts on zoology and rhetoric," Aristotle thought, a deep wave of frustration tightening his chest. "Instead, my mind is a battlefield of petty grievances. I sit at my desk, pen in hand, but I simply cannot focus. The words will not come through the noise. Menander leaned back, a knowing, slightly cynical smile touching his lips as he tossed a small wooden token between his fingers. "You are suffocating in your own study, old friend," Menander said, his voice laced with the casual irony of a playwright who watched too many tragic heroes destroy themselves over trifles. "You cannot outthink mental fatigue while sitting at a desk surrounded by the very students who caused it. Come with us. We are heading to the public bathhouse near the Dipylon gate. Let the hot water and the steam scour the day's bitterness right out of your skin. It is time to step out from your clinic and wash the dust of the Lyceum away." Demetrius nodded in agreement, standing up and smoothing his tunic. Menander speaks true. Even an empire cannot be managed by a mind tied in knots. Aristotle hesitated, looking between them, then let out a defeated, half-amused huff. "Very well. If the steam can loosen this grip on my skull, lead on." As Aristotle, Menander, and Demetrius stepped out into the bustling street, heading toward the baths, Lysandra watched them go from the doorway. She lingered for only a moment before turning back into the dim, fragrant interior of her shop. There was no time to dwell on philosophers' burdens. Work awaited. Lysandra watched from the doorway as Aristotle, Demetrius, and Menander disappeared down the street toward the Dipylon gate, their footsteps fading into the afternoon hum of the city. She lingered for a moment, letting the heavy quiet of the Apothecary settle back over her shoulders, before turning back into the dim botanical refuge of her shop. Work awaited. She walked over to her heavy stone mortar, tying a clean, coarse linen cloth around her mouth and nose to keep from inhaling the potent, dust-like particles of the dried resin. Her hands moved with practiced, methodical precision, falling into a rhythm she had practiced 1,000 times. Opium must be ground down meticulously before it can ever be steeped into a tincture or boiled into a draught, Lysandra thought. Gripping the heavy stone pestle with both hands and leaning her entire body weight into it as she pulverized the dried poppy pods into a fine, bitter powder. If the pieces are left too coarse, the medicine loses its strength, rendering the dose useless to a patient writhing in agony. But grind it too fine, and the bitter dregs cloud the brew, ruining the entire mixture. She applied steady, downward pressure, the scraping sound of stone against stone filling the silent shop. Every drop of this city's pain passes through these doors, she thought, her arms aching slightly from the exertion as she watched the dark, aromatic powder gather in the basin. The statesmen argue in the assembly over grain and gold, the philosophers tear each other apart over virtue in the colonnades, and the tyrants march across the plains with iron and blood. Yet when the fever hits or when a wound festers, they all come crawling back to this little room. With careful, measured movements, she swept the ground opium into a clay bowl, mixing it with fermented wine and carefully measured botanical extracts to balance its numbing potency. Her eyes scanned the rows of unlabeled clay vials waiting on the wooden shelf, mapping out the deliveries she had promised to make across the city before nightfall: soothing balms for injured soldiers, calming draughts for the sleepless, and potent elixirs for the sick lying in the shadowed quarters near the agora. She poured the dark liquid into small vials, sealing each one with a dab of red wax and stamping it with her mark. Amidst the collapsing politics, the threats of tyrants, and the tired complaints of philosophers, someone still had to keep the city breathing through its pain. Athens's public bathhouses, Balanian. The air inside the public bathhouse near the Dipylon gate was thick with vapor, the heavy smell of wood smoke, and the damp musk of 100 sweating bodies. Menander, Demetrius of Phalerum, and Aristotle walked side by side into the damp warmth of the tholos, the circular chamber designed with smooth sloping floors that funneled wastewater away toward the subterranean drains. All around the inner perimeter, stone and terracotta sitzbaths were arranged tightly side by side. Bathers sat hunched in these contoured individual hip tubs, slaves moving briskly between them with bronze basins, carrying warm water heated by the massive wood-fired furnaces burning in the subterranean service rooms below. Stripped of their cloaks and civic dignity, the three men settled into adjacent basins. Slaves immediately stepped forward, anointing their skin with fine olive oil, mixed with ashes and sand to draw out the grime of the city streets. As they scraped their skin clean with curved bronze strigils, the surrounding chatter of the bathhouse washed over them like the steam. They say Antipatros of Macedon is demanding another tribute from the port. A merchant loudly grumbled 3 tubs down, his voice echoing off the curved stone ceiling. If the assembly accepts, we won't even have enough grain to make it through the winter. Another voice chimed in from the adjoining basin, shaking his head. It is no mere tax. Antipatros and his administration tighten the screws with every passing month. They demand these heavy tributes and grain allocations, primarily as a tool of political subjugation and financial control, keeping us permanently on our knees. And why would they stop? A third bather muttered, scrubbing his skin with a strigil. Following the suppression of our revolts, imposing steep financial burdens serves their strategic purposes all too well. Enforcing subjugation is the entire game. These financial exactions keep Athens economically strained and utterly dependent, ensuring we can never rebuild the military strength or naval fleet necessary to launch another rebellion. Precisely, the first merchant agreed bitterly, leaning back into the warm water as a slave approached with a fresh pitcher. The wealth and grain extracted straight from the docks of Piraeus aren't just piling up in northern treasuries. They are being used right now to maintain Macedonian garrisons, pay off their mercenary armies, and secure absolute political stability across the region under Macedonian hegemony. We are paying for our own chains. Forget the grain, another voice chimed in, a younger man leaning forward with a conspiratorial smirk. Have you heard the rumors coming out of the Lyceum? They are debating whether justice is an absolute virtue or merely a social contract designed by the weak. The philosophers are arguing over the nature of the cosmos, while the Macedonian garrisons sit right outside our walls. Aristotle paused, his metal strigil hovering just above his forearm. He closed his eyes, listening to the abstract political debate floating through the steam, a faint, weary sigh escaping his lips. They dissect virtue in the shade of the colonnades, while the city burns beneath them, Aristotle thought, shaking his head. Men love to intellectualize their ruin, treating the collapse of a polis as little more than a topic for an afternoon lecture. Demetrius, ever the pragmatist on future statesman, leaned back against the rim of his stone tub, his eyes sharp as he observed the restless crowd. Let them talk of metaphysics, Demetrius muttered quietly to his companions, wiping a smear of oil from his chest. Words cost nothing. But unless someone stabilizes our currency and secures the trade routes from Piraeus, Athens will starve on its own rhetoric. Menander sat in silence, his bronze strigil scraping hard against his skin, as if trying to scrub away the very air of the room. He stared across the circular chamber at a group of prosperous citizens loudly debating civic liberty, while slaves washed their feet. A bitter, melancholic smile touched the young playwright's lips. Listen to them, Menander thought, his chest tightening with a profound, suffocating disgust. They sit in their clean water, scraping oil from their arms, pretending they are free citizens of a glorious democracy. But it is all a delusion. A painted facade stretched over a skeleton. Athens is nothing more than a theater now, a stage where old men play at being statesmen, while foreign kings pull the strings from behind the curtain. We trade in illusions and call it civilization. He tossed his strigil onto the stone floor with a sharp, echoing clatter, standing up as a slave approached with a pitcher of fresh, cold rinse water. Come, Menander said, his voice flat and detached as he stepped out of the basin. The water is warm, but the air in the city is unbreathable. To be continued in Episode 4, Bounty of Boeotia. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesia's Playlist. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.